Welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast, featuring author and ministry leader Kent Evans and business executive and military veteran Lawson Brown. This is a show for you, Dad. You want to be a godly and intentional father. Unfortunately, you've turned to these two knuckleheads for help. Let us know how that works out for you. Before we begin, remember this: you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. Please welcome your hosts, Kent and Lawson.
Kent, here we are in the middle of, or coming on the end, I guess, of Proverbs 16. Has your mouth ever gotten you into trouble? Don't answer. Don't answer, because I already know that hypothetical. But in the research that has been done through Manhood Journey and in emails and conversations, dads say all the time that they struggle with communication. And Proverbs 16 has a lot to say about communication and what our words can do and mean. And so I'm excited to get into this one, Kent, with you. But before we do, I guess you got an interesting email from one of our buds out in California.
Yeah, for the last couple of years, I've become like pen pals with one of our listeners and a guy who has taken some of our courses and all that. His name's Chris Powell. What's up, Chris? Good to hear from you. And a few weeks ago, he emailed me something and gave me permission to read it. So just so no one feels like I've stolen Chris's email unfairly. Right. But here's what he said, which I thought was fantastic. You and I did, before I read it, you and I did some podcasts on contentment and entitlement as part of an enemy of contentment. And that's what Chris was listening to. So here was what he said, and I quote, "So I'm a little behind on listening to your podcasts, but I am kind of glad that I am. Right now, I'm listening to the one about entitlement, and I became immediately filled with guilt because earlier today, after waiting 3 hours at the urgent care with my son, I needed to go get some coffee. I stopped at the closest Starbucks thinking I'd be in and out in about 5 minutes or less. Well, I waited for about 20 minutes, and there was one person in line ahead of me. Only one. The person only got one drink. When they finally called my name, I did not respond well. I responded like a super entitled brat. I felt bad, but not bad enough to apologize. And now your podcast. Oh, wow, man. It's really speaking to me right now. Thank you so much for what you guys do." Okay. End quote. I thought that was hilarious when he was like, I felt bad, but not bad enough to apologize. So guys, the reason I wanted to read that is, number one, you are not alone. You're not alone. If you feel like you're an entitled brat, at least there's two in this country, you and Chris Powell. You and Chris are both entitled brats. Secondly, you're not alone. Secondly, email us. Let us know what you're up to, man. If a podcast has spoken to you, or if you disagree with us, or if you thought we raised a fun issue, let us know about it, man. And we love getting those emails. We're so small as an organization, those emails don't even go to my people. Okay, those emails actually come straight to me. One day, I hope we're so big, I've got people, but not right this second. Other than Hunter. Hunter's amazing, but still, we both get our own emails. So just send us an email. Third, leave us a message. Go to manhoodjourney.org/podcast. That's manhoodjourney.org/podcast, and hit the button and tell us your biggest challenge as a dad, a great idea you had, a funny story as a dad. We want to play your ideas and questions on the show. And finally, share the show with somebody. There's another Chris Powell out there who is also an entitled brat, and we need him to not be an entitled brat. So send him this week's show. Now, Lawson, back to you and the actual topic of today's episode.
Chris, first of all, you are not an entitled brat. You said you felt like an entitled brat, or you acted like an entitled brat. So don't listen to Kent Evans. So let's hone in on this. Communicating is difficult. There's a lot that goes into it. We can break that down, but I love what this Proverbs 16, there's 3 or 4 verses that have been picked out, and what they tell us about how our speech, what we say, the way we say it, shapes our influence. And I want to be a good influence to my kids, to my wife, to my friends. I want to be around people as well that are a good influence on me. And so some of the things that dads have mentioned is, it's how do you get a conversation started? What is the content of the conversation based on the environment of the situation? How do you get them to open up? What kinds of discussions can you have with your wife that is uplifting to her and moves your family in the direction that you believe that God has in store for you guys? And then, like just connecting with people. It takes language. It takes time together. It takes speech. And so, I guess I would turn it back to you, but I think just time together, period. You don't have to say a whole lot necessarily in all situations. Time together helps build relationship. But the words that you say, and I don't mean, hey, Dad, make sure that you're giving good sound advice and using the following principles on, whatever you're trying to deliver. It's questions, asking good questions and being a good listener. It's all part of communication and things that your children will remember about the way that you talked to them, the style that you use, the setting, that sort of thing. It all plays a part in how our speech shapes our influence.
Big time. What we've done over the last several weeks, if you haven't been listening, if you're dropping in right now, we're covering the chapter Proverbs 16. And the reason we picked that one is because it has a lot to say to dads about a lot of topics. We've talked about all kinds of topics, from wisdom to money to managing our relationship with our wives and our children. Tons of great content. Go backward if you want to listen to all the episodes. This might be episode 6 or 7 on the topic. And today, because Proverbs is one of those parts of the Bible where each 2-line or 4-line phrase is kind of its own sort of stanza, or sometimes they do stand alone, we feel like we can have the liberty of pulling out a few that are on a theme. Often this would be pretty dangerous to do in any other book of the Bible because you might be chopping up the context or chopping up the message. But in Proverbs 16, there are a bunch of topics covered. We're going to end our series on Proverbs 16 this week and next week, talking specifically about how we use our mouths, what comes out of our mouths, whether it's good or bad, and whether it's positive or negative. Today, we're going to talk about how our speech shapes our influence as a dad. Next week, we'll talk about gossip and some of the words we use that tear down. But if you're following with us in Proverbs 16, let me read for you the 4 kind of focal verses we're going to pull out of Proverbs 16 this particular week. They're verses 13, 21, 23, and 24. And I'm going to just read them real quick and we'll go from there, Lawson. 13 says, Proverbs 16:13, righteous lips are the delight of a king, and he loves him who speaks what is right. Righteous lips. Verse 21, the wise of heart is called discerning, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Verse 23, the heart of the wise makes his speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to his lips. That word for judicious might be like prosperous or successful or wise. And that word for persuasiveness might be learning or even doctrine. So the heart of the wise makes his speech wise and adds sound doctrine to his lips is another way to kind of read that. In verse 24, gracious, or even some of the times that word right there, the Hebrew word used for gracious would be used for pleasant or beautiful. So pleasant or beautiful words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. It's almost like that age-old phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is completely unbiblical. Because what we're seeing here in verse 24 is gracious words are like a honeycomb. They can bring sweetness to the soul and even health or remedy or cure to the body. Man, Lawson, as we talk about using our mouths in ways that are persuasive, sweet, careful, what comes to mind, man? What did you think of when you saw these verses?
Yeah, sweetness of speech. I really want to think about that. It increases persuasiveness, so if you're trying to persuade something, it makes me wonder, the harsher and more direct, or the more detail oriented. That's where I would go. That's where I would think, like, to persuade someone or to be persuasive, you need to use logic and reason and details and, get to the heart of the why. And maybe so, but the sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. I like that. I want to come back to that. And then what you said was speech makes his speech judicious. I think of judicious as like using the right amount. Like if you're judicious with your resources, you measure carefully.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something there. Let me ask you this: what do you think of when you think of the word influence? If our speech shapes our influence, what does that mean as a father on purpose? Let's start there. And I said earlier, I want to be influential. You can be influential in a lot of ways that are not necessarily being a godly father on purpose. You can really mess some things up. And so talk about that. What does that mean to you to be your influence? What does that look like?
Yeah. I mean, as a dad, specifically in the area of being a dad, I want to be in a position where I have access to my children. I was talking with not talking directly, but through my wife. We were talking with a friend of ours recently. My wife was, and there have been almost a year and a half between conversations between this individual and their adult child. So there's like a long time, and this person just hasn't been able to get their child to even connect with them or talk with them. So imagine that, Lawson. You got two daughters. Just go a year and a half and not talk to them at all. And I know for some of our listeners, man, that'd be a short time. They've gone 2 years or 5 or 10 years. And the beginning of influence is access. Can I even get in the room, and can I even get their ear?
Mm-hmm.
Like I have no influence at all right now with, the president of the United States directly. I don't have access. I'm not going to be in the Oval Office anytime soon. He's not going to call me and ask my opinion. I never have. Probably I'll die and never will. So there are people outside my influence. But inside my influence, man, my wife, my kids, I have access to them. Now 3 still live in my home, and I feed them and, clothe them and house them. And so it's pretty easy to have access to the ones at home. It can be a little trickier when they get to be adults. And so for me, influence, part 1 is access. Part 2 is, will they seek my counsel? And I don't necessarily mean with every big major decision, there's like some forum and we sit down, but do they even want my feedback or my opinion or my thoughts? If I don't have access and they don't care to have my input, I probably have zero influence. And there's a lot of people, probably there's roughly 7 billion people on planet Earth with whom I have no influence, right? I mean, the vast majority of people, I'm never going to have influence. But then we get to the topic of, if I do have influence, if I can speak into their life, the question then becomes, unto what, in what kind of direction, so no one's going to argue that like Adolf Hitler was not influential. He was extremely influential. Even to this day, we still experience some of the ramifications of his influence, and it was extremely evil and very negative, and very powerful and very diabolical. So then the question becomes, well, I'm definitely not trying to be, I'm not trying to take over the world and kill a bunch of people. The question is, if I have influence with Lawson Brown or our producer Hunter or my wife or my kids, what influence am I having? Is it a good influence? Is it a bad influence? Is it an influence that's centered on things of this world like money and success and jobs and work? Or is it a spiritual influence? And so for me, the penultimate, the tip of the mountain as a dad is, do I have spiritual, godly, positive influence in the lives of my wife and my children? And, it's something that I strive for, and I want to be true. And what I hear in this stretch of Proverbs is how I talk to them will dramatically cause or not cause that influence to happen or be negative or positive. And my mouth is a key piece of the influence puzzle.
Wow, that was really good. Yeah, and it's interesting to me that in Proverbs 16, 21 and 23, the word persuasiveness is used. So it's clear that part of, I think, what we're using this in context with is it's clear that part of our role as a father is to persuade. I want to persuade my children in a direction that I know is best for them. Likewise, that's why you spend time in the Bible, because our Heavenly Father is persuading us, is winning our hearts, is growing wisdom in our minds by spending time with Him in prayer and through reading the Bible. I want to hone in on judicious speech, because what I wouldn't want to do, and I try not to do this, but I do, is I get wrapped around the axle a little bit on exactly how to design the right moment for something, or like I overthink all the things that.
Do you think you overthink?
Right.
Because
exactly.
Man, dude, if you think you overthink,
yeah,
it's exponential.
I do. I overthink. I'm analyzing all the time, and I think sometimes it's not that we have really prepared well for something. It's that we are coming, like we've prayed about it. We're in the right space, and we are coming to someone genuinely with the right attitude and the right heart. And that 13 talks about righteous lips, 21 talks about sweetness of speech. I glean from that it's partly our attitude toward the communication.
So okay, you've hit on something. You've hit on something that oftentimes, I find the King James version of the Bible to be a bit harder to read and sometimes just really confusing. But this Proverbs 16:23 is one where if you go read the King James, it actually is remarkably illuminating. And I'm not saying that the NIV or ESV or your favorite version is incorrect. What I'm saying is there's a layer of understanding. So let me read the King James version of Proverbs 16:23, and then watch what happens when we read that. It says, "The heart of the wise teacheth his mouth." The heart of the wise teacheth his mouth, and addeth learning to his lips. So notice the progression. Like if you're kind of like diagramming that sentence,
right.
What's the object? What's the predicate? What subject is acting on? The heart of the wise teacheth his mouth. Isn't it interesting where how many times have we spoken before we've thought? All the way.
Right.
And our mouth is out in front of our thoughts or our heart. This verse in Proverbs 16 would say, wait a minute, your mouth should be learning from your heart. For what is stored up in the heart of man comes out. Jesus talked about that and said, for the good man brings treasure out of his heart and it comes out through his mouth. And so the sad truth of the matter is oftentimes our mouths are a thermometer, and what they're showing us is what's in our heart. And sometimes we'll say something and go, man, where did that come from? Man, I'll tell you where it came from. It came from your heart.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you like it or not, that's where it came from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so true. You remind me, I've spent this last week with a group of people that I work with, and one of them is just like, I can't wait to be around him, because he and I hang on every word. Not only does he know a lot, like about our business and stuff like that, but gosh, just the way you can just feel an energy, about the way he is talking to you, and the words that he uses, I think are always, he just always is positive, optimistic, like, versus versus
that other guy.
Either those times when, I try not to be, but can be that guy that's like, oh gosh, I'm just tired. I had a, flight delay or, whatever. And that is not attractive. That is not persuasive. But man, I can't wait to be around the person who is like a light and uses good positive, uplifting speech, even when it's about something like fire sprinklers, which is our business. He could still make it fun and interesting. I'm just listening and learning, and but it's because I feel something, and that is because he is not only smart, speaks what is, helpful, I guess, in that scenario, but I just love the vibe. I love the energy. And I think that makes a difference. For us as dads, are we like that? The way you just described that guy, would your children describe you that way? Not you, Lawson. I'm not looking for you to say whether they would or wouldn't, because that would be embarrassing. What I'm looking for is, let's just lay this off on someone else, someone listening to this podcast, for example, because I don't know, would the people around us, whether it's our wives or our children, our associates at work, our colleagues, our the other people on that volunteer committee, would they say the same thing? Yeah. And that buys him, for me, influence, because he's got easy access. He, can offer things, and I listen. I want his counsel, because I crave that. I crave being persuaded by him. Before he even gets going, I'm in. I'm on board. Now we do have a history, and it's not like I'm meeting a stranger. But even when you meet someone new, immediately you're deciding whether or not something in this conversation is going to be of value or something useful or something you're going to listen to. And pretty quickly when it's not, when it's off-putting maybe, or you're just getting something from that initial meeting, that initial meet and greet kind of thing, that you're like, as soon as I can get out of this, I'm finding an out. And that means that there is no influence. Their speech shapes a lack of influence in that for me, because I'm done listening pretty quickly. And, I don't know, I'm making a lot of that, the opposite of it, but it does ring true, at least for me.
Hey, Lawson, have you ever wondered, how are you doing as a dad? Have you ever thought that?
All the time.
We know, we're dads, you and me. We know that is a constant challenge for dads, is how am I doing? So what we built was the Godly Father Quiz. It's a 28-question, totally free online tool. You can go and take the survey and figure out where are you now and where you want to go next. How does that sound, Lawson?
It sounds great. I've done it, and it was very helpful. I love it.
Dad, right now, pull over, put down your Coca-Cola, get off of the internet. No, wait a minute. Go back to the internet. Go to manhoodjourney.org/quiz, Q-U-I-Z, manhoodjourney.org/quiz, and take the free, totally free Godly Father assessment today so you can know how you're doing as a dad and where you need to grow and improve. Well, I was at an event this past weekend with some Christian leaders, and one of them I've known for, probably about 10 years, maybe a little longer. And I've probably spent an aggregate of 20 hours with this guy, maybe 30 over the span of 10 or 12 years. And every time I see this individual, his name is Greg, every time I see him, I feel like I get something valuable, and I feel like I'm better off as a person. And sometimes he's asked me some pretty difficult questions, not like gotcha, but he's just a lot more, he's had a lot more business experience than me. He's managed much larger enterprises than I've managed. And so his counsel is always really valuable, just from a raw business standpoint. But the way he says it the spirit with which he says it, the spirit with which he'll ask me a question, which is, the question is kind of not meant to expose my weakness. That's not what I mean. But he's definitely asking me a question because he thinks I don't have something totally figured out. But the way he asks it never feels attacking, never feels threatening, always feels like designed for my benefit. Even the harder questions, like, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? And I can just think through, probably 20 or 30 different interactions with this guy over the last 10 or 12 years, and they've all left me better off. And if he called me tomorrow and said, hey, I need you, I have an idea, I want to run something past you, or I need you to be somewhere. I mean, my default setting is absolutely, where do I go? Where do I sign up? And he's continued. So anyway, I could go on and on about this individual. One other guy, Lawson, I used to work for French boss, and I worked for a lot of guys who happened to be French in their heritage because of the company I worked for was based in France. And this boss, Alexi, used to have a way. He had a way of being extremely persuasive, even in a very indirect communicative type culture. Like it was unwelcome in that culture to just directly say, Lawson, I don't know. I'm not sure your idea is going to work. Right. Even something like that would be like, oh my goodness, a bomb just went off in the room. You can't say that. You can't say it. So here's what Alexi used to do. Someone would get done with the presentation. And I distinctly remember him this one time saying it to a colleague named Michelle, a guy named Michelle. And he goes, Michelle, thank you for this. Do you suppose if we do this, we could be accused of being out of touch with our customers? And I just love the way he came at it. Was so indirect and so cautious and do you suppose, like, right. Maybe not. If we do this, second qualifier, we could be accused. We're not out of touch with our customers, just we could be accused. And so there was this indirect, like, third enemy in the room. That's them, whoever them are. It was me, the guy presenting. Wow. Do you suppose, Lawson, if you and I cover this topic on today's podcast, we could be accused of being out of touch with the dads listening? Like, it's just so gentle and so careful, and translated over to Americanese, it was, man, what a stupid idea. Yeah. What you just shared is a dumb idea. Yeah. And it's not going to work, and it's going to cost us a lot of money. Therefore, and I just think, wow, he was so persuasive and so influential. And today, here he has more than $1 billion under P&L, under management. Thousands of people have reported up to him. And at the end of the day, he found a way to be very influential without hardly ever being directly attacking. Yeah. And it was a really delicate art, and I was schooled in it for the couple of years that I worked directly with him. It was really good. You'd think I would have learned more, and it would have picked up better, and I would have been a better purveyor of the skill, but I'm really not. Yeah,
I would have thought so. But clearly not. Hey, I don't know how exactly this weaves in, but I remember a time when Olivia did something. She was a young-ish teen, maybe not even teen, maybe 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there. And she knew it was wrong. She was clearly remorseful, like had learned a lesson already. I think it was something at middle school that was embarrassing. And she did something or joined in with a little gaggle of girls, and they collectively hurt someone's feelings. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. I don't remember, but I guess my point is, she didn't need counsel from me. It had happened. The consequences had occurred. She had hurt someone and saw it, and had concluded correctly, that she was in the wrong and was genuinely remorseful about that. So I didn't need to sit her down and break it down and go through it and use the right words. What she needed was a hug and a bit of a gracious shoulder. And that was my role at that time, was to let her, kind of cry it out and figure out, maybe she didn't need me to make her roll around in her mistakes. She was doing that herself. She needed somebody in there with her. And so it wasn't words that I was giving. It was words that I was hearing and maybe reinforcing through, my body language and just being there with her. And so I guess my point in bringing that up is when I'm thinking about these 4 verses in Proverbs 16, it is about us as dads. We're either winning or losing opportunities for influence. And sometimes the winning can come by the right moment coming across and us being open to God's leading in how we handle that. It's not necessarily about getting the words right and having our speech judicious and gracious and being, reciting some Bible verse or something like that in that exact moment. It's the relationship that we've had over time and are developing, and just being there for them in certain ways. So I know we're talking about speech and our words matter and all that, but sometimes it's being gracious means being there for them and being that relief, that shoulder for them to let it all out on.
I love how you said we're either winning or losing opportunities for influence, if I heard you right.
Mm-hmm.
And that is killer, because I can think of, oh man, more times than I would care to disclose where I lost influence because of my words. And not even just because of the exact words I shared, but because of the nature in which I shared them, or how aggressive I was, or how antagonistic I was, or even my body language or facial expression. A friend of mine was talking not long ago about how there's like 2D communications, email, texting, and there's 3D communications. You and me, not necessarily in the same room, but like on the phone or even by Zoom. And we got to be careful to not try to handle 2D issues in a 3D environment. So for example, if I need the report of how the sales went, just send me the dumb report. I'm good. Send me the report. That's a 2D communication. But if we got to address something that's difficult, or something that has the potential to be misunderstood through texting or email, we should probably pick up the phone and call that person, or get on the Zoom. I remember one time talking with a friend of mine who's a mentor, and he lives in Cincinnati, and I was describing something, and then he kind of asked me a couple questions, and we were going back and forth, really healthy, great exchange. He's really a brilliant business guy. And at one point he leans onto the Zoom, and he leans way up by the screen and goes, "Hey, Kent, looks like some of what I'm saying might be irritating you." And I remember thinking, man, I hate Zoom. I hate the fact that he can see my face right now, because he was exactly right. He was exactly right. Some of what he was saying was not just confusing me. I was frustrated. And I said, yeah, some of it is like 85% of what you're saying, I'm on board. 15%. Yeah, it's frustrating. And he's like, why is that? And so we went on and had a conversation, but he was one of those guys who had the ability. His name's Jim, and Jim has the ability to offer you feedback in a way that is gracious, that his speech is judicious, his speech is sweet, even when his speech is meant to instigate or challenge you. He himself isn't instigating or challenging in his demeanor. And so I know a lot of dads that they walk through life and they wish they had more influence with their children, especially as their children age. I mean, let's be honest. We have total influence of a 7-month-old, right? Because they can't do anything. But of a 17-year-old or 27-year-old, the question becomes, how much influence do we have over time? And the vast majority of our influence is going to come from our example, how we set the example, and also the sweetness of speech. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was in Lexington, Kentucky, talking on the podcast of a friend of mine, and we're going to actually have him on a podcast before long. And Scott and I were talking, and we were talking about adult children as they get older. One of the questions that I have asked, and I'm also going to double down and ask again, of my older boys as they leave my house, maybe in their early to mid 20s, after college, that kind of thing, I'm going to say, hey, when or if I observe that you are hitting the rumble strips of life, when you're hitting the rumble strips of life, what would you like me to do? Do you want me to kind of say nothing? Do you want me to pray for you? Do you want me to kind of mention that something's going on that I have observed in either your marriage or your finances or whatever? Or do you want to come to me? What do you want? What do you want? And I'm just going to kind of offer it up. And I think for the most part, I've talked to a lot of dads who have adult children, and they're like, yeah, you pretty much don't want to lean in unless you're invited. At the same time, and I know there's a ton of wisdom in that, and I'm not at all debating that. I also want to kind of tee up the idea with my children. Sometimes you have a blind spot, and the blind spot is by definition something you can't see because it's called a blind spot. And so do you want me in that game? And some of my kids might say yes. Oh, sure, man. If you see something, let me know. I'm an open book, blank check anytime. Some of my kids may go, nah, you know what? I'm married. I've got a wife, or I've got friends, or I got a pastor. I live in this. Great.
I'll come to you if I need to.
Great. And so for me, I want to be a dad who has influence. And I think what we've all got to recognize is if Proverbs is telling us that gracious words and sweet words and carefully chosen words increase our influence, well, then guess what's probably also true? Harshness, hatefulness, badly chosen words, ungracious type language probably decreases our influence. And I love the way you put it, man, because I don't think influence is constant. And I don't think it's like this frozen value that just stays the same. We're either growing our influence or we're shrinking it. And our words, according to Proverbs 16, have a lot to do with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that's you're offering your adult children the opportunity, the ability to opt in for your input. You're asking them, how do you want my influence? Let them choose how they want it and when they want it, and even if they do. But part of that's going to be predicated with, have you been over time someone who is, like James 1:19 says, quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry? Have your words been judicious? Have you used sweetness of speech? Have you been gracious in your counsel before? So that they know, like, Dad, I do want you in on this, because I trust that when you come to me with something and you're pointing like, hey, you do realize you're on the rumble strips. You hear that noise? Right. They know that you're going to come with, they want you've earned that influence. You've earned that access. You've earned the ability to give counsel because they trust it. They know that you're coming from a place of prayer and having, gained wisdom through learning of your own, and you're going to deliver it in a way that someone would want to receive it. You think of, from a practical standpoint, if you want to give someone something and it is wrapped up and it's, pretty, and, you're coming with a big smile on your face, they're much more open to receiving something than if you're coming with a scowl on your face and your fists clenched. They're not going to be. And so, I don't know, I'm paraphrasing and boiling that down probably a little too simply, but my point is, the opportunities to win influence or lose influence, that score, I guess if you try to put a number to it, if your score on the wins is higher, they're probably going to be more receptive, and your influence is going to be more easily and readily received. So I think thinking about this, let's just not gloss over the fact that, it doesn't mince words here. It says sweetness of speech, judicious. It says gracious. That's how we win influence with our children and with our families. It is not being the smartest, the most logical, the most detail-oriented, and the most factual and winning arguments. It boils down to sweet, gracious, judicious. And so approaching our conversations with our children with those things in mind, I think are my takeaways,
Yeah.
from this today.
Yeah, I would say as we're going through Proverbs 16, one of the things, Lawson, we've been doing with the dads is looking at cross-referenced scriptures that help us understand the topic more deeply. And that's a good Bible study kind of habit, sort of a knee-jerk reaction we should have is where scripture speaks in one place, let's use scripture to interpret scripture and use cross-references and to help us deepen our understanding of this topic. And I would leave our dads with probably 3, and you already brought one up, and that's James 1:19 and 20, quick to listen, slow to speak. Ephesians 4:29 says, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up. As fits the occasion, it may give grace to those who hear. So when we talk, are we building people up? And that'll tie directly to our episode next week. Come back and be tuned in for that one. And then finally, Colossians 4:6 says, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Let your speech always be gracious. And man, you talk about some Bible verses that are really convicting to me. Always be gracious. Wow. How about we're going to go with the Ken Evans version in closing today of Colossians 4:6. Let your speech intermittently and occasionally be gracious. That would be way better, way better fit for Ken Evans, because always gracious. Wow, man, wouldn't that be something? And so, Dad, if you want to be influential in the lives of your children as they age and as they hit their teen years and their older teen years and their empty out of the house, empty nesting kind of years, let your speech be gracious. Let your speech be seasoned with salt, and let's be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry, and just see if your influence with your children doesn't grow over time in proportion to the sweetness of your speech. Lawson, thanks a lot for the conversation today, man. It's meant a lot to me, and
me too.
It's also very convicting. I know you and I get on this podcast to try to help dads. At the same time, I do have to acknowledge this is an area where my speech is not always seasoned with salt, and it's not always gracious. And so I really enjoyed even the sandpaper of having to pull today's episode together, because it was as much for me as it was for the guy listening.
Yep. Good stuff.
We'll talk to you guys next week when we deal with gossip and bad speech. See you then. Hey, Dad, thank you for listening to today's show. If you found this episode helpful, remember, you can get all the content and show notes at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. And if you really liked it, please consider doing 3 things. Number 1, share this podcast with someone. You can hit the share button in your app, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just call a person up and tell them to listen in. Number 2, subscribe to this podcast so you get episodes automatically. That helps us as well to help dads find the show. You can do that through your favorite listening app, whatever that is. And finally, review this podcast. Leave us a review, good or bad, wherever you listen. Those reviews also help other dads find the show. You can always learn more about what we're up to at manhoodjourney.org or fatheronpurpose.org. We will see you next week.
You've been dozing off to the Father on Purpose podcast featuring Kent Evans and Lawson Brown. Now, wake up. Head over to fatheronpurpose.org for more tools that can help you be a godly, intentional, and not completely horrible dad. Remember, you are not a father on accident, so go be a father on purpose.